This is Open Source Tonight, episode who knows what, because I haven't done one of these in a long time, and you probably don't care anyway. I'm your host, Vincent, and today I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, because I have very, very, very simple patterns like this, Carmen Shields. How you doing, Mr. Carmen?
I'm doing good today, Vincent. How are you?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. Glad to be recording an episode of Open Source Tonight. So let's hop into the open source and Linux news for the week. So up first, Ubuntu has made a major theme change for its next release. And personally, looking at the screenshot, can I just say this gently? Ugly. Case closed. Don't. I like their old theme better. I like the... Well, actually... I guess so. It's a dark and a light theme, isn't it? Never mind. You have a dark version. It's fine.
I think this just reminds me of how Ubuntu was probably around 2010, 2011 before they started making a lot of theme changes. But I don't know. Honestly, it's been so long. I would have to go back to actually be giving you an accurate representation. I used to use Ubuntu quite a bit in that time range specifically. So it's something that really is ingrained in my mind.
Yeah, the older Ubuntu themes from, like 1204 and stuff like that, I thought was quite ugly, honestly. So I'll have to, get yelled at in the comments about that one probably. But I don't really think that the old theme was that pretty. But 2004's theme looks really good. And honestly, this looks very similar to the 2004 theme. I can't really tell much of a difference at all. I'm trying to see, and it does look like there's a slight change around certain things. Maybe like the bar at the top, it looks like it might be a little bit less curved or something, but it doesn't really look that different. Especially for the black theme, it looks pretty, or the dark theme, however you want to call it. It looks pretty much the same. So yeah. Have you seen 1804's or 1804 and 2004's themes? Or 2004 themes, I mean.
I have, but to be honest with you, I'm not as familiar with that as I could be. I think you're probably a little more familiar with those releases. I was running Ubuntu a while back. I'm kind of going back and forth, but I'm starting to think that I need to install Ubuntu again.
Yeah, Ubuntu is one of my favorite Linux distros, so I mean, you're gonna get my support on that one, obviously. But yeah, the themes look different a little bit apparently. This article here I'm reading from OG Ubuntu says that the mixed theme too much work to maintain, so it looks like they're gonna get rid of the mixed theme, like the standard theme, where it's like a mix of light and dark. I kind of actually liked that combination of a theme, but I ended up using dark anyway. So, I guess it doesn't really matter, I guess I was probably doing what everyone else was doing.
So this is horrible, but I think I was actually confused because I thought they were adding in a theme from the implication I had gotten. Well, yeah, I think honestly the part of the problem with that is you're taking away choice arbitrarily, and you see this a lot of times in the technology industry where it really grinds my gears because I think as technology progresses, there should be more options for people, and the most disappointing trend I've seen in software of any kind is just the limiting of features instead of actually adding cumulatively more and more.
Yeah. I mean, one of the nice things we have in the open source community is the fact that, we can easily build a theme for a Linux distro that's not from the distro vendor, right? So we're not locked into the vendor's, environment. I, in the past, have not used the default Ubuntu theme on a lot of different Ubuntu distros over the years because I used to think a lot of the older distros, like I said, was kind of ugly looking. And so I would just put my own theme on it that made it look the way I wanted it to, right?
But I think it was power you... Go on, I apologize.
I was going to say, but I mean, I think, to be fair, Ubuntu is... more for like new users to a certain extent and things like that in Linux Mint. So I suspect a large percentage of the population running Ubuntu is probably running default theming or, very similar to it.
I think, yeah, I think honestly, most people and even a lot of geeks don't really care how it looks. Again, I don't know. I think a lot of people, that's conflicting. I think people do really care about looks, but it just depends what they're going for. I don't know how many people do care or not to the point where it's a make or break. But I think if you're a power user, you're like you said, I think you're going to be installing your own themes anyways. And I think the general market, they're just trying to aim towards the general market. And when you're Ubuntu is and I hate to say this because I don't even want to compare it to Windows, but it is kind of the Windows of the Linux world in the fact that it's the most popular. but I don't think that's really an apt comparison either. I just don't think there's much better to compare it to, just in terms of its significance in the community. But of course, the Linux community is much different than the Windows community, and that's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. But my whole thing is, I feel like you could have more options there, but of course, there's ways to customize it too. And these are really just this is really just okay. You're getting started. If you want to install another theme, then go do that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's different schools of thought on whether Ubuntu even is a new user distro anymore. And I can see both sides of it. I mean, some things they do make it quite easy to do certain things, but in other ways, there is some stuff in Ubuntu that I feel like, yeah, they are kind of leaning more into the power users now. And I don't really feel the need to leave Ubuntu, but I understand, the undercarriage of Linux quite well, right? I can get under the hood of Linux and change config files and do a lot of customizations that, a new user would probably not be willing to do. And if they did, honestly, they'd probably break something. And I say that from experience because when I wasn't a user, I broke stuff.
Oh yeah, and honestly, here the whole thing is like, I think I don't know this. I'm kind of just saying this, but I feel like their long-term goal is to become like the Windows, like the default, not necessarily like overtaking Windows, but beyond where we're at right now, even where Linux is commonplace, where you can buy a PC at Best Buy. And I'm sure there's some you can, but I mean where it's more of the standard option. You can buy a computer at Best Buy or at a regular electronics store. It's running Ubuntu Linux. I feel like that's kind of their goal, is to be that company, to be the one that you see that's the face of Linux.
Yeah, like the Linux distro that is kind of, the market leader, if you will, and the one that is being used by a lot of the consumers in that space. And I think Canonical, the creators of Ubuntu, have really positioned themselves in that way, because if you look at companies like Dell and HP and different companies like this that are shipping Linux on computers, they are pretty much, with very, very rare exceptions, shipping Ubuntu by default and maybe giving you the option to also install Red Hat or one other distro like Fedora or something. But the reality of it is it's really like Ubuntu is usually the default, or it's the only option at all if it's going to be running Linux, right, from the factory. So I do think that they are kind of positioning themselves that way. And Linux, and specifically Ubuntu, I find to be pretty powerful. Like, yes, it's somewhat new user-friendly, but some new user distros that I've used, like the ones that are easier than Ubuntu in some ways, that easiness comes at a cost to the point where there are some things that's even harder to do. And so I think that Ubuntu kind of splits the middle kind of pretty well, where someone like me that likes Linux and understands how to change config files and stuff can get under the hood and really play. But somebody that's just like my mom could also use Ubuntu, and just kind of treat it like, that's my environment. I don't need to customize it. I don't need to understand it. I can just click on Firefox or Chrome and, open up Facebook or my email or whatever it is that I want and just use it.
Right. And I know we need to get on to the next story, but I will say this is that when you're thinking about, like, you talked about Dell and HP a little while back, and it's funny that we got from themes to this, but I do think it relates indirectly, because all of the changes that are being made to Ubuntu are to make it more appealing to the general populace. But in my opinion, I don't know that as a fact. I don't work for the Canonical, but I do think that's what they're going for. It kind of feels more like an Apple or a Microsoft and an open source flavored than a real. It is a community project, and I'm not saying that to dog people who work on it, but I feel like they're definitely going for more of a brand there. But honestly, I think you see Dell was actually one of the first ones, I think, major vendors to even put Linux onto new computers you could buy. But even then, it was only special order, and they've been doing that for a long time. But I don't know if they've ever sold Dell computers that have Ubuntu actually pre-installed in computer stores. You might know that better than I.
I seem to remember there was a deal with some vendor that was selling Linux laptops a while back in some Walmarts and Best Buys. Seem to remember reading a story about that. Let me just look that up. But yeah, I believe there was something about that where you could get like a Linux pre-installed laptop at Walmart. Let's take a look here. Yeah, there's a category on Walmart's website for it: Linux laptop computers. Walmart.com. So yeah, they've got HP machines in here. Looks like thin clients mainly. Actually, it looks like all thin clients. Okay.
Truthfully, in about 10 years, I'd like to see a giant like marketing style display for Ubuntu when I walk into the local Walmart electronics department and be like, Ubuntu Linux. You have a bunch of laptops and stuff you can demo, and it's like hyping it up. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but I think that'd be really cool. I know so the next story we've got here, the Linux kernel has been released. We've got Linux kernel 5.13 and number of new facets. The thing that fascinated me the most when I was looking over this article beforehand was the support for the Apple M1 chip, which there seems like there are a lot of comparable ARM chips out there. But the thing that I think the Apple M1 is revolutionary in the fact that it's not like it's an original concept. And honestly, it's part of that Apple magic where I think it's like it's an idea that was already there and they just put it into the mainstream. But I think it's the catalyst to bring ARM to the desktop. This is the point. I think the M1 is starting it's got the whole industry kickstarted in that direction. I think that's very positive. Whether you like, even though I know this is an open source podcast, but what else, Vincent, did you see in the article that they improved in the Linux kernel?
Well, before we get to that, actually, I just want to comment on the ARM processor thing. As far as ARM processors go, I mean, yeah, they've been around for years upon years. The Pi has been using them, things like that. And there is Linux-powered laptops and stuff that have been around longer than Apple's. But the reality of it is, talking about ARM, I think this is probably going to do, like you said, push it more into the marketplace. But what I'm considering, to be quite interesting is RISC-V, which is a completely open source. It's kind of like ARM in the sense that it's reduced instruction set. So it's, going to be lower in power and things like that in theory, hopefully just like ARM, but it's completely open. The spec is open, so anybody could build one of these. So I do wonder if that we will see with this new architecture, it take up the place of ARM in the future because it is open source. And I have noticed a trend in the computer industry over the last few years that open source is something that places want. I can say that it would be really cool to have an open source CPU in my computer, something that I could get the plans for, right? I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to build it, but it would just be cool to have the option.
And I do think that's true. Open source is interesting. I was actually trying to explain it to someone, and I think the biggest problem with like explaining open source is first you have to really have a good I think that code is very abstract if you don't know much about it. And I'm not saying the person I was talking to specifically didn't, but like a lot of people when you say what open source, they're gonna look at you funny if they don't know about computers. But I think there's definitely, I think that you mentioned RISC-V, and I honestly don't know much about that. I'll be honest here. I don't want to sit here and talk on a podcast and act like I know something when I don't. I don't know much about it, but I think that the possibility of an open source architecture is like that is awesome. Like, I think I think that could really have some potential there. I don't know much about it, but just I like the idea of it. Okay, I'll be honest. I like the idea of it. I don't know much about it, but that's why I'm here.
Yeah, and I will say, talking about processors here too, reduced instruction set processors, and I don't mean RISC-V 5 processors specifically, but like, that kind of style of processor like ARM and MIPS and things like this have done a lot of really interesting things in the past. They've proven to be very power efficient and can also be really good in video production, by the way, too. If you ever watched the first Toy Story film, you have seen a film that was rendered using MIPS processors. No joke.
That's what's interesting. Like the 90s, you saw a lot of this experimentation. I feel like the 2000s, I felt like it really became like the x86 market. But, you don't really see the MIPS. You don't see the RISC. Yeah, I mean, those types of processors are used in very specialized applications usually. So I don't think usually a general consumer would have ever touched those in the first place. But I would like to see in 2020 and beyond an opening up of the landscape, if you will. So like you see right now in this article we read, new Linux 5.13 is where we started at talking about the M1. So the M1 is, of course, you all know, Apple's latest and greatest silicon that everyone is excited for. And I think that, as I was talking about earlier, you see the market penetration for ARM possibly going more towards ARM in the desktop space with that. But I would really, like you said, I would like to see an opening up of like standards, a second renaissance, if you will, because in the 80s and 90s I felt like the computing sphere was a lot more open. That's before my time, of course, but and then I feel like the market really got cornered, and that it would be really refreshing to see maybe a second renaissance of like, okay, like you have a different silicon you can choose from. I don't know. I'm interested to see what the possibilities are in the next 10 years. I think we have a lot of positive potential in terms of personal computing and computing in general if we go if the industry moves in the right direction.
I would agree with that. And talking about Linux, I think as far as where Linux plays into ARM and RISC-V and MIPS and all these processor architectures, Linux historically and Unix has been able to run on a variety of processors because like Unix, Linux is written almost entirely, like the kernel's written in C. Some of the user-land applications, like the display server and things like that, they are written in C. And so we've got a lot of things that are very portable, right? That in theory shouldn't take too much to move from one architecture to the other. If you look at Linux distros, for example, they've got PowerPC builds and ARM builds, both 32 and 64-bit ARM builds and x86 32 and 64. And you get the idea. So I think that this really helps Linux because if you look at some operating systems, particularly if you look at Windows, from what I have seen, Windows, they really are heavily in an x86 world. If you look in the early days, Windows really was in that x86 or an x32 world, right? They were in the early Intel processors and things like that. And now they're, in the AMD, Ryzen's and, the new Intel cores and, well, they're not new, I guess, but, well, the newer ones, but you get what I mean. And so I think that Windows, if you want to see Windows market share go down and you want to see Linux go up, Microsoft has proven in the past that they suck at working with ARM. They've done, at one point they did a version of, I think it was Windows 2000 that worked on MIPS. And from what I heard, that didn't work very good either, from what I can remember. I may be wrong on that, so don't quote me on that, anybody. Look up your own research on that. But I seem to remember hearing something about Windows on MIPS didn't work very well either. Again, I never used it. I don't have personal experience. Don't take my information as facts. But the thing about it is, like, based on what I've seen with Microsoft, they just do not handle other processors well with their operating system. So I think that this could be a time for BSD, for Mac OS, which is based on Darwin, which is based on BSD, and Linux. All of these heavily C-based operating systems and with interpreted languages on top and different compiled languages that seem to be relatively easy to move. Windows, I think, as an architecture is really tied too much to x86. Based on what I have seen, they just have a lot of trouble with anything else. So
there's a lot of dependent. Is it you feel like it's something to do with how Windows is coded? Like they're very dependent on how x86 works as a platform.
I mean, I think that's part of it, but I think the other part of it is they have so much market share in x86. It's like, well, if you download something for Windows, they kind of expect you to be using an x86 processor, right? For example, if I wanted to download a video production tool, it has to be x86 on Windows, realistically. I don't see anything that's for ARM,
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, realistically, I would really like to see that change. And really, I get that, but that's part of the bias. People have to start challenging that and saying, hold on a second. Like, why don't we have more of our applications? But I mean, really, it does take kind of a shift in the market sometimes. And that's the unfortunate thing about it is there are a lot of times where it is just it's not necessarily the most realistic to expect every developer to support every processor in a proprietary environment. Open source, I feel like there's more of an incentive in a way. I think it really just depends. If you have enough of a market share, then I could expect x86. I could expect to see a lot more applications natively ready for ARM. I mean, honestly, if Microsoft could I know this is getting off of open source, or, I think the whole industry could learn from Rosetta. But at the same time, there's probably comparable solutions in the open source world. My whole question is, like, you really have to have some sort of compatibility layer, unless you have a company or a driving force that's really getting developers to get these apps onto, or some sort of like a market force that gets developers really motivated to bring their apps onto other platforms, other silicon platforms, such as ARM or RISC-V, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Windows has really struggled with trying to do translation layers. And the reason Apple, if you look at the reason Apple has had so much success, from what I understand, they have done acceleration to certain operations that translate into ARM instruction sets, or into the ARM instruction set that is going to be commonly used repeatedly from something like an x86 translation, right? So that's how they can speed up their process. A normal ARM chip, from what I understand, still doesn't have the same speed, even though I have seen tools on Linux that will emulate x86 on like a Raspberry Pi and in videos and stuff. And from what I've seen, the performance isn't actually half bad. So I do think there is some fundamental flaws in Windows. Their file system has got issues. They're using a code base that I can tell you right now, based on, if you look, you can go in Windows now, Windows 10, and find applications that look like they haven't been changed even like at all, right? I don't have the code in front of me to prove that, but they haven't been changed much if they have, because they've got the same UI, everything's in the same place, literally since like Windows 3.1. So
Yeah.
that tells you something. If you look at Linux and you look at Mac, we throw stuff away eventually. And I think that's part of the reason the Unix-like workflow and Mac OS technically being Unix certified, I think helps us, because I really believe in that form factor of an operating system design. But I think just the willingness to say, look, we're not going to try and support computers, that are ridiculously old anymore. Windows still has support for DOS programs to a certain level. Did you know in DOS, or not in Windows, sorry, you can't have a file named con anywhere in the file system, because used to, when you wanted to print to a console as a programmer, you would write to a virtual file in the file system called con, because you might want to run a DOS program and they have that compatibility there. Little things like that are still all over Windows. And sure, maybe 5 people need to run that DOS program. We have things like DOSBox for them. I find it hard to believe that we really need to be that concerned about legacy. Like Linux, in some ways, might even be too legacy not focused, because there is issues with legacy in Linux. But anyway, I've gotten us like 100 miles off a topic at this point. I hope you're enjoying the episode, everyone.
So in the Linux 5.13, I don't know much about the security side. You're a little more interested in security than I ever was, but Linux 5.13 introduced the landlocked security module. Could you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, so this looks to be... Yeah, so it says here this can be used along other security modules like SE Linux. SE Linux, for those that don't know, is basically it's a security feature that's built into certain distributions of Linux, specifically Red Hat distros like Fedora, CentOS, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And honestly, every time I deal with it, it's a pain in the daggone butt. Which with security, you usually trade off security with making it easy. So I suspect the security, from what I've seen, SE Linux and things like that, can be useful for certain things. But this particular feature, I don't know too much about it. I'm just reading about it here. But from what I can tell, this seems to be kind of something that will be just included in the kernel. So SE Linux, for example, is something that you only see in certain Linux distros, right? This is something you could use in any Linux distro, which could be useful, right, as people move around on Linux distros.
It does note that there is cross-compatibility with other security modules such as SE Linux. I don't know how that implementation looks or why you would want to run both, but I don't know if there's something that Landlock doesn't have or vice versa, where that would...
So it looks like that. So this supports the TPM on modern computers and the trusted platform module, and you can have keys stored on this, from what I understand. And so basically, this is, from what the looks of it, is this landlock control module. You can control and restrict what processes can and can't access and things like that in a more locked down way, from the looks of it. So again, I'm just looking at a 10,000 feet overview of this stuff, and I might be missing something. So please tell us in the comments on this episode if we're missing something. But it looks to me like that, yeah, there's some improvements for security. There's new driver additions also in this release. So if you've got the Amazon Luna game controller, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, looks like Luna, that particular device, its drivers are included in the Linux kernel now, so that should give you plug-and-play support, touchpad and keyboard support for the most recent Microsoft Surface laptops has been included. A temperature monitoring driver for WMI Gigabyte motherboard has been included. That's actually pretty interesting, because if memory serves, my new PC build has a Gigabyte motherboard. I have to test that out. And hardware monitoring for NZXT Kraken liquid coolers has been added. Cool. So there's some bunch of improvements they've added. Looks like they've got some stuff in here about the Apple Magic Mouse 2 has multi-touch support being added and battery reporting inside of the kernel. So yeah, a lot of really interesting things here from the looks of it. They've got a bunch of new drivers and some new security features. So yeah, time to patch. They also apparently have tweaked the ext4 file system a little bit here. And they're talking about some stuff that honestly I don't know because I haven't looked at the code, and I can see them referencing some functions here so that have been changed and stuff. So if you know ext source, then maybe that will be useful to you. You can check out the links in the show notes. Moving on, Linux gaming laptops. There's a new Linux gaming laptop in town, everybody, with a 3K display, 15.3 inch display.
But the question is it RISC-V based? Come on, Vincent. We got to ask the questions.
It's not, but it does have a Ryzen 7 or 9 processor in it, and or an Intel i7 processor that you can get in it. So those are pretty good processors, right? Especially the Ryzens.
Yeah, I would have to do my research, but it seems like you get more for your money with the Ryzens, and the higher end Ryzens seem to have more performance than anything Intel really has on the table.
Yeah, I wasn't a really big fan of AMD, but honestly, I recently built a new PC and it's got a Ryzen 7 3700X, which confusingly apparently is not a Generation 7 CPU, even though it's called a Ryzen 7. CPU people, feel free to explain to me how that's actually an older generation. I don't really care that much, but if you want to enlighten me in like a paragraph in the comments, let me know. I'm just happy it works.
Probably some sort of silly naming thing. Like they thought Ryzen 7 sounded good and they started using that name before they actually had the 7th generation. I don't know. Maybe I'm just guessing.
I don't know either, but what I do know is that my Ryzen processor, which was I think it was about $300 new, that thing like performs like ridiculously well, and even doing like software rendering a video on it, like that is like something that most CPUs really struggle with, and it does it really well.
I think it's funny though. I looked up your CPU. I think that's the lower mid end of them.
It is. It's not the highest end one.
That just kind of blows my mind. It's like I think your build has a more powerful processor than probably most of the computers I've ever had. And just period. And like that's the consider the fact that that is what is the lower mid range now. It kind of blows my mind. Where even something like that could do almost any task you need to. But just imagine how much performance some of the highest CPUs have. Some of the fastest CPUs.
Yeah, I mean, the Ryzen CPUs have gotten really good, at least the one I've got, and I've got friends that have them, and they seem to be like really good. Like, they run Linux well, from what I understand. They run Windows well. And the thing about it is, like, I think this CPU is more than most people need, honestly. Like, the reason I got this one, I was trying to build a budget video production computer. And this machine, one of my buddies helped me spec it out. Thank you, you know who you are. And this system, we picked that CPU because I'm on a budget, right? I was trying to spend as little money as I could and still get like a really decent system, like, because I didn't have $10,000, $5,000, even $2,000 or $3,000 laying around that I could just be like, let's just throw this into like the ultimate video production rig, So I put a used graphics card in it I already had and the Ryzen CPU. And what's really amazing to me is my NVIDIA graphics card renders video slower than my CPU does. That's something I've never had happen to me before. So if you want to render video, I can totally see why people like the Ryzen CPUs. I didn't really understand it because people would talk about the Ryzens, how good they was for video. And I'm like, but normally you use the GPU for most of that. Honestly, if you have a Ryzen, I can totally see why you just use the CPU. It's so fast. And I use DaVinci Resolve to edit. And if you look at DaVinci, when you're rendering, it uses both the GPU and the CPU at the same time based on my tests. And it mixes them together to get the best performance. So it will like really push my CPU because it can tell it can handle it. And then my GPU, that's a little more weak. It will just, use it for something. I don't know what, but it's like 20-30% usage at the most, right? So the most of that processing is happening on the CPU. But anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. This particular machine has got a NVIDIA card in it, actually, ironically enough.
Base price on this unit is from 1799 euros, which in American dollars,
$1,799 US.
That's what?
$1,799 US.
No, that's the euro price.
Well, I put it into a converter, and that's what it gives me. That's weird.
I Oh, that's weird. What
Let me try a different thing here, because like that's
I've already got it brought up for you, not to steal your thunder, but I googled it, says $2,144.64. So we could say
yeah, that
2,100.
makes more sense.
Round that up to like 2,150. Technically, I think you would round that down because I don't know. Rounding rules, ladies and gentlemen. We're going back to math class. So,
No, not math class. Let's stay away from there.
oh gosh. Well, I think that I'm interested to see the proliferation of Linux gaming laptops. I think that you can run a lot of Windows games on Linux perfectly fine. Honestly, though, part of me is kind of conflicted with this whole Linux laptop category, Windows laptop. It's kind of like the same thing. Like you see certain companies like that make POS hardware, right? You use like a grocery store or a retail environment for checking out, and half these computers are the same as any x86 box you could pull off the shelf from Dell or HP, slap a different name on it, maybe put some nicer components, and they may not even nicer, just components that are designed for stability, but really it's not any different than any other x86 box like it. And I'm not saying that to totally dog this. Like, I'm glad to see gaming laptops out there. I would just like to see it within the next 5 to 10 years where we have a little more platform agnosticism, not so much that like maybe even Linux is the default, but more so that Windows is not the default. And I don't know if we're going to get there, but like I'd like to see a world where like choosing Windows or Linux is a comparable option, where it's not just where it's not just the default. I'm not trying to dog. I'm not necessarily trying to dog people who do use Windows and enjoy it, but I will say I think there needs to be more room in the industry for proliferation of operating system platforms where we aren't covering a Linux laptop every day, because Linux is included on a lot of laptops. And it's not even thought of as a Linux laptop anymore.
I mean, there is vendors that do that, as we discussed, earlier. I will say this: I would love to see Linux become the dominant operating system on desktop, but even just come to the point that major companies like Adobe support it, and you can use their software. Avid supports it, and things like that. Because for me, really, the only stuff I really need Windows for is edge cases, mostly around video production tools. And so it would be wonderful for me to get to the point where, I could have Avid Media Composer, like that film studios use on Linux. I could have Premiere Pro. I could have Final Cut Pro. That's probably never going to happen with Apple. But
say, like, I think this laptop looks pretty good. A thing I like about it is it's like for a gaming laptop. Of course, it got a little more bulk on it, but you have to think it has like a full graphics card in there and a pretty good laptop CPU. But I will say this much is that, like, if I was going to get a gaming laptop, I think I would get one like this. And there's not all the RGB, and nothing against that. I think some of that stuff can be cool to mess around with. Don't get me wrong. And maybe I'd change my mind in the future. I don't want to necessarily like link myself to that in a way I can't get out of it. But I will say that this much is that when you are buying a laptop, you have to find something that works best for you. I think a lot of gaming laptops are a little more versatile than most, and I just wish there was a way that we could get such that desktop level of graphics power in a small form factor. I think that's what Apple's kind of going for with the new MacBook, but I don't know how well that translates when you're talking about x86, because that's a system on a chip, which allows you to have a little more, I don't know, system on chip.
x86 is not a system on a chip thing.
No, I know that. I'm saying that M1 is a system.
You're talking about the Apple, yes. The Apple SoC is, yes.
But what I'm saying is that I feel like that allows them to have efficiency, allows them to accomplish a little bit more in ways that a lot of Windows laptops have to be much bulkier. But that being said, considering that ARM may be proliferating more soon, we may see a slew of laptops that have some sort of integrated graphics solution with system on a chip. But then again, I don't know, because Apple is one of the largest companies out there, has money to throw at it, so they probably have some secret sauce we don't even know about.
I mean, we do know that Apple has people in-house that does custom chip design for them based on ARM, and so they've got resources that I suspect that most manufacturers that are smaller and that are more off-the-shelf kind of manufacturers may not have as many of on site. But anyway, moving on. Speaking of Linux laptops, here's another one. It's called the Slimbook, and it's a Ultrabook. And this machine actually looks so much like a MacBook, it's actually quite amazing, honestly. It's a very beautiful machine. I actually, if the price was a little lower, I would probably go for it. I'm not saying the specs are bad. It's just I don't know if I'd really want a laptop this pricey. But it says here that the laptop has got a 14-inch LTPS screen, and it's running 2880 by 1800 for its native resolution. It's got an i7 processor, quad core, up to 4.7 70 gigahertz. 8 gigs of RAM is the base amount, and you can go up to 64 gigs. It's got Intel Iris Xe graphics. 250 gigs of SSD base, can go up to 2 terabytes using a spare M.2 drive. Or no, up to 2 terabytes, and I think it says there's a separate, spare M.2 drive. Connectivity, it's got Intel's Wi-Fi chip AX200, Bluetooth 5.1, USB Type-C, Thunderbolt's on there, USB Type 3.0, or Type, not Type, but USB 3.0, HDMI out, SD card slot. This could be actually a pretty decent machine. I could see as somebody that would like to make docs and like being able to travel, or somebody that's always on the go for some other reason. I could see this being useful for them, maybe if they just need something to take notes on or something. It doesn't look like you could probably edit video on this that much, or anything like that. But you could at least, I think, probably view clips, and you could, watch YouTube on it and browse the web. This is kind of, I feel like it's really just a Linux laptop that is designed to be kind of like the MacBook Air equivalent, right? The specs are decent, but it's kind of more, a low end, which makes sense. I mean, it's kind of an ultrabook. That's what they're for. And then it's starting from 1,299 euros. And let me convert that to US dollars for the US listeners. It is $1,548.63. So, about a 1,600 something once you round up for taxes and stuff. But anyway, so it looks like an interesting machine. Any thoughts about this, Carmen? Would you be interested in buying one of these if you had the money?
I think it's cool to see an ultrabook that's user upgradable. Then again, a lot of machines are user upgradable. I think it's a cool looking machine, and we could see a lot of potential for more ultrabooks hopefully in the future running Linux.
Yeah, this isn't the first one, I don't believe. I think there's a few others as well, if memory serves. But yeah, it looks actually pretty cool. And again, I mean, if you look at the image here, which you can check in the show notes, everybody, it looks quite nice. The other thing, too, it's got a 90 hertz refresh rate on the screen, and it's got 99% sRGB coverage. So very nice screen from the sound of it. I think it would be pretty good to look at. Moving on to our next story, and we've been going for a while, so I'm going to try and wrap us up here in a few minutes for everyone tuning in. We've got the tablet that wants to compete with Apple, or at least that's one of the lines here in the article. It says fancy throwing a $500 commitment at the promise of, I'm paraphrasing this for the record, but fancy throwing $599 at the promise of a Linux tablet that could rival Apple's iPad. Well, here we go. This is an option. So I didn't actually paraphrase that as much as I was going to. But anyway.
I mean, they've been trying to do that for years. So nothing against this one, of course. I don't want to disrespect them. There's just a lot of projects they've tried to do. But I think what is significant about this, and I feel kind of bad saying that because I don't want to disrespect them. I think what's interesting is that this is running Linux, and it's also running a customized version of Linux. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's running a Linux-based distro called, I hope I pronounced this correct, Jang OS. I apologize to the developers.
I think it's like J-I-N-G, Jing. I could be pronouncing that
Jing
wrong.
OS, that might be the right pronunciation. It's using an open-sourced UI, it says here in the article, tailored for tablet use. And if you look at the UI, it does look a lot like an iPad or an Android device interface, so something I think people could be used to. And it's using Qt, the Qt toolkit, and elements of KDE Plasma's desktop environment for this. I will say, personally, when it comes to this, I feel like that a Linux-powered phone or laptop it's a pipe dream. To be able to get like real support on it. Look, can you browse the web on one of these? Sure. We've got Linux-powered smartphones that have been out for a few years. But you're generally not going to have Instagram or the Facebook app or the official YouTube app on it probably. And sure, some of us open source developers will probably build using their API something that is not really the official one, but is kind of like the unofficial YouTube app, right? Where you can view YouTube videos from the API or something. But like, I don't know. I find it hard to believe that we're going to see market share go high in this, because most consumers are going to want access to their frequently used apps, and I think most people have already bought into the architecture, or not architecture, but the platform that they're on. They're on iOS, they're on Android. They bought about a bunch of stuff on it. They've got the apps they like on it, right? They kind of, they've been sold on it already. So, I'm interested to see where this goes. Don't get me wrong. I would love to see an open source Linux tablet, and it actually does look pretty cool, but I don't know. What do you think, Carmen? Do you think they actually have a shot at being able to break into the market and actually get market share?
I think so. People seem to be backing this. And I'd have to look and see how many backers exactly. I don't have it right in front of me at this moment in time. I did have it in front of me a little while ago. But I think that the potential for this tablet could be interesting. I think it looks very slick. It reminds me kind of an iPad with the bezel. I mean, not the bezel, but how I guess the bezel would be the right word. Just how a display looks and the rounded corners. What I'd like to see is like a hybrid. Like, I think that's what they're going for, but it still felt a little bit tablet-y. But like, I don't know. I think some of the applications they're showing in the beginning just looked like the desktop version placed onto a tablet. But I think like that's kind of cool at the same time to be able to interact with that. But I think if there was some sort of way to really smoothly implement that, and I think that's kind of what they're trying to go for here, it'd be very interesting. The other thing too is I'd like to see I think they said the display on this is pretty high quality. Do you know what the exact resolution is?
It says it's 2K resolution. So until I don't know about now, but I know a few years ago, a lot of films in the U.S. was screened at 2K resolution in digital cinemas around the country. So 2K is pretty big. If you can put a 2K image, which is a little bit bigger than 1080p HD, on a massive screen and be able to see it fine, I think this 11-inch 2K AMOLED touchscreen, I think it's going to be pretty nice to look at. I'd actually kind of like to see one here at some point. The processor looks pretty nice in this machine. 8 gigs of RAM. I think this tablet is going to be an actually quite powerful piece of equipment. And I will say, I mean, you were talking about having desktop apps on Linux. There is libraries out there to translate apps and do things like that. And I've seen some interesting things with it. Like, I will say, if you know how to develop Linux desktop apps, building the mobile apps is really easy from what I've seen in videos and stuff. As someone that knows how to build Linux desktop apps, it does seem like it's not that hard to do that for the phone and for the tablets. So I would be really interested to see, how, much apps we get on there, and also how many things get, translated properly. I think this tablet, like you said, it's got a lot of money after, as far as backers and money. Maybe we'll have a shot at it, right? I mean, I would like to be surprised. But anyway, it's got 256 gigs of storage. It's got dual band Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5, a USB Type C 2.0 port, a micro SD card slot for expansion, a 8,000 milliamp hour battery, 16 megapixel rear camera, and an 8 megapixel front facing camera, fingerprint reader, and noise canceling microphones. And this currently retails for $699, but it says RRP in parentheses next to it. I think that, I don't know what that's a reference to. Probably that it's going to change or something after like the Kickstarter. Yeah, it looks like that the full set of tiers here, and then it talks about different tiers. And so I think that like if you get the tablet, yeah, $549, and then it goes up to $599, and after the first 300.
Is it like a Wacom or like a kind of like an iPad does? Okay, so it says it has a 4069 pressure sensitive stylus. So that makes me think you could draw on this or like do animation on this if it has a pressure sensitive stylus. I don't know if it'd be at quite the professional level, but I feel like, I don't know. I'm kind of starting to get interested. Maybe I should buy one of these.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I would like to be better at animation and 3D animation. I want to be good at it, but I just don't know. I feel like I might have a better shot at 2D at this point. But then you kind of really need one of these drawing tablets. So, like the Wacoms or something, and something like Blender will work with those. What I'm curious about is Blender could be compiled for ARM support, put on this thing, and you could, in theory, do animation walking around. And honestly, I like to play with Blender. This, if you were like really like into like 2D animation and you're using Blender's 2D animation features for that, or using this in like 3D and doing sculpting with it, it could be pretty cool to take this like a client site and be like, hey, let me show you what I'm thinking with this design and everything, and just right there on the tablet, right? Be able to do it right there. And then you can just, render it out and send them, that would be really cool actually. So maybe that is where this goes as the market goes towards the professionals, because a lot of professional CGI specifically is done on Linux through things like Maya and Blender and things like that. Now, Maya doesn't have an ARM version or anything right now, as far as I'm aware, but they do have an x86 version on Linux. So, they might add this. Blender, as far as I know, doesn't have an ARM version either, but again, they're open source, so we could just, someone could build that. But it would be really cool. So maybe that's where they target with this.
Well, shoot, I'm interested to see what's going to happen with the Jing OS tablet, and JingPad is what it is called. I'm saying Jing OS because I just think of that operating system as being like one of the draws for it. At least I don't know if it is for me personally, but I think that's kind of what they're going for. But okay, I'm interested in seeing where that goes off to. Well, Vince, is there anything else you want to talk about today?
I don't think so. I think we pretty well covered everything. And so, yeah, everybody, thanks for watching or listening to Open Source Tonight. I'm your host, Vincent Maggard from East Kentucky. Thank you so much to Carmen for hosting with me this week. Carmen, where can they find you online?
If you want to go to my Twitter handle is Wonder Shields. My YouTube channel is my name, Carmen Shields. Just search it up, Carmen Shields, and I will come up. I'm the guy with the eyebrows.
Alrighty, sounds great. You can find me at vincentmaggard.com, vincentmaggard.dev, Vincent Maggard on YouTube, Vincent Maggard on Twitter, Vincent Maggard almost everywhere. Instagram, you can find my professional Twitter account, Vincent Maggard Media, to see what I'm up to in the video production world, though I don't really do much on there. But anyway, thanks everybody for listening or watching. Talk to y'all again very soon. Goodbye, everybody.